I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Okay, so today we're going to talk about Daniel's 70 weeks, the wrath of God, and we're going to try and get to the rapture as well. Now, to begin with, on the particular subject, Daniel's 70 weeks, this particular perspective was shown to me by the man that led me to the Messiah and introduced me to the scriptures for the first time. And so I'm not taking credit for this perspective. I'm going to give the credit for introducing it to me and to others, including to Brother Ruckman, to a man by the name of Mr. Williams. He actually did have a sit down with Brother Ruckman in, I believe it was Red Lion, Pennsylvania, at Red Lion Bible Church in the time frame of the late 80s, we'll say. Okay, so this is our perspective, mine and Mr. Williams, on Daniel's 70 weeks. We are not saying that you have to agree with us. We are just providing an alternate viewpoint on it. So to begin with, Daniel's 70 weeks are located in Daniel chapter 9. In fact, 70 times a week of years, or a Sabbath or a Shabbat of years. The correlating passage for that is in Genesis 29, verse 27, when the Torah says Laban the Syrian is telling Jacob to fulfill Leah's week. Because you remember, Laban snuck in Leah to Jacob instead of Rachel at first. And then when Jacob had something to say about it, Laban said, look, fulfill Leah's week, meaning fulfill her Shabbat of 7 years. So Laban was basically drawing the equivalent of this 1 week as 7 years in the Torah. And the Torah does use that throughout the scriptures as the standard. So when we get to Daniel chapter 9, which we will do here in a minute, and you see that 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and thy holy city, the 70 weeks are in fact 70 Sabbaths of years instead of a Sabbath of days. Okay? All right. Now, first we have to understand that there are other time periods like this given to Israel and to the Jewish people. There are 3 others, okay? So the fourth one is in Daniel 9, but there were 3 others that preceded it. The first one was Abraham to the Exodus, and that was approximately 490 years. And the references to find those 2 events would be Genesis chapter 11, as you see on the board, verse 26, and Exodus chapter 12, verse 51, in those 2 passages. All right, the second 490-year period was the Exodus to Solomon's temple and the dedication of Solomon's temple. So you would go from Exodus 12 and you would check that passage and then cross-reference it with 1 Kings chapter 8, just about the whole chapter. The third 490-year period was Solomon's temple to the permission of Artaxerxes, or what is called the Edict of Artaxerxes. And the permission of that edict is referred to as the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. And that particular event is found in Nehemiah chapter 2. So you would check 1 Kings chapter 8 again for the dedication of Solomon's temple, and then you would also cross-reference Nehemiah chapter 2. And additionally, you'll see that the going forth, that terminology is found in Daniel 9, the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. All right, and then here we are now. The fourth time period is the permission of Artaxerxes, or the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem, to the stoning of Stephen. And why we say that it ends there is because there aren't, for a lot of reasons. In the first place, in the first 490-year periods, those periods are not broken up. They're not divided up into sections. They are consecutive and they are continuous. And we believe that the 490-year period mentioned in Daniel 9, which is the fourth one, also is consecutive and it was continuous. It had no breaks in it. Now, Western theologians, many of them are going to take that 70th week and break it off and put it way at the end of what they call the church age, what Jesus calls in Luke, Etot Hagoyim, which is the times of the Gentiles. Our perspective is that we don't see that there's a break. We see that, in our perspective of the scriptures, that it ran out at the stoning of Stephen, and we'll get to that in a minute. And the passages you want to look at are Nehemiah chapter 2 and Acts chapter 7. It runs into chapter 8. We just didn't have enough space on the board to put Acts chapter 8 up there. Okay, now we're going to get into the actual passage of Daniel 9 and verse 24, which we will begin reading. Okay, in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and thy holy city. First of all, who are we talking about here? Thy people, Israel, thy holy city would be Jerusalem. Again, not any place in Europe, not the Scottish Highlands, not Berlin, not Munich, not Rome, Jerusalem. So Israel and Jerusalem, okay? 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up division and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. We're talking about finishing it all up and the entrance of the Messianic age. The Messiah's culminating coming, where he then begins to rule and reign. Okay, let's keep reading. Verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment, the edict of Artaxerxes, the permission of Artaxerxes, to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 62. 7 plus 62 is 69. So total of 69 weeks. And the street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And just read through Nehemiah and you'll see that. 26. And after 62 weeks, after the second period, 62 weeks, but you had that initial 7 weeks before that. So it's after 69 weeks. And in this case, we see the word after meaning you're in the 70th week here. After 69 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. That, of course, would be the crucifixion. Okay? And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So what we see there is we see a reference to after 69 in the 70th week, Messiah is cut off. And the people, the prince that shall come, is a reference to, of course, Antiochus Epiphanes, when he later on, after this prophecy, desecrates the temple in Jerusalem. But what's important is the next verse, because this is where, right up to here, just about, or we'll say an overwhelming majority of serious Bible scholars and theologians will agree. But when you get to verse 27 is where the disagreements start to come out, okay? And here's why. It's the antecedent of that word he in verse 27. Let's read it. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. We see that he, and we see the antecedent of that he to be Messiah. Now, other theologians will see that as some kind of anti-Messiah. We don't see it that way. We see that the Messiah confirmed his covenant with his people for 1 week, and in the midst of that week, he causes a sacrifice and oblation to cease by being crucified on the cross. Remember, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom at the end of Matthew. You remember, if you read the account in the Gospels, when the Messiah was crucified, God was showing that this particular part of the Torah was completely fulfilled. There is no need for animal sacrifices anymore. Okay? So the he shall confirm the covenant many for 1 week. In the midst of the week, right in the middle of that 70 weeks, the Messiah is cut off. He confirms the covenant with many during that week, and he causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Now, that would mean that, somewhere in between 483 and 490 years is when the Messiah is cut off. So more than likely right around the 486th to the 487th year of this last 490-year period we're talking. Okay, we still have 3.5 years left. Okay, and so what do we do with that 3.5 years? Well, the way we perceive it is from the time the Messiah is cut off, but not for himself, until the stoning of Stephen, Acts 7 through into chapter 8. At the stoning of Stephen, what do we have? Well, in the earlier chapters of Acts, we have Jesus sitting at the right hand of God, right? But in Acts chapter 8, or Acts chapter 7, toward the end of 7 into 8, we see at the stoning of Stephen, the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And why is he standing? Because at that instant, he could have decided to return. But because of the rejection of the Messiah and the rejection of Stephen's message, the kingdom was postponed for Itot Hagoyim, the times of the Gentiles. And right after Acts chapter 8, when Stephen is stoned and the Son of Man is standing, all of a sudden we have a new rabbi getting converted. Rabbi Shaul, the Apostle Paul. And his focus is not just to his own people, to the Jewish people, but also to the Goyim, to the Gentiles. And so the kingdom is postponed, but the end of that 490 years was right there at the stoning of Stephen. There are no breaks in the weeks or in the 70th week and take it apart and dissect it and attach it way at the end of some period of the Gentiles. Remember, 70 weeks were determined upon thy people and thy holy city. So it was exclusively a reference to Israel and to Jerusalem. It was not a reference at all to, was not inclusive of the Goyim at that point. But at the end of the 490 years, that testing period, that last testing period that God gave to his people, when they rejected Stephen's message, God said, okay, that's it. We're going to meet with Rabbi Shaul. He's going to be converted, and then he is going to then take and focus on not just the Jewish people, but also the Goyim. Of course, Paul never cast off his people. So that's where we differ and disagree with a lot of Western theologies. We don't see any break in that 490-year period. Okay, now, how does that affect the time period called the wrath of God, as the Bible calls it? The Bible doesn't say anywhere anything about the Great Tribulation period. It does say Great Tribulation, okay, in a broad sense, but there isn't a time period called the Great Tribulation. It says Great Tribulation in Matthew chapter 24, I believe. Okay, but that Great Tribulation is upon, just in general, the people on the earth. Okay? What people refer to, or what theologians refer to as the Great Tribulation period, is actually something that the Bible calls the wrath of God. And you will see here that Revelation 11, 1,260 days is roughly 3.5 years with the two witnesses. Revelation 12, the man-child is caught up to God and to his throne. That is for a time, times and a half of a time. That is 3.5. That equals 3.5 years. Revelation 13, the beast is given power to reign and to continue for 42 months, which equals 3.5 years, not 7 years. So this indiscriminate chopping off a portion of Daniel's 70 weeks and then attaching it to what is called the wrath of God, we see as an erroneous designation. And we disagree. We don't believe that the 490 years, that the last portion of it has still yet to come. Okay? And we're not saying that you have to agree with us. We're not saying you have to believe what we see. But we saw no other breaks in these other three 490-year periods. So why then does the fourth one have a break? It ran consecutive, it ran through, and it ended at the stoning of Stephen. And that's why the Son of Man was standing at the right hand of God instead of sitting at that instant. Okay. Now, the rapture, or what is called the rapture. The Greek word is actually harpazo. And a lot of people will say raptizo. That may be a variant form, but the root form is harpazo. I catch up. And the concept is kind of like the bird, the raptor, that predatorial bird when it hunts. Raptor, it catches up, okay? Harpazo is used in 2 Corinthians 12 when Paul is caught up to the third heaven. It's the same word. The word is used in Revelation 12, again, the man-child being caught up to God and to his throne. And the word is used in 1 Thessalonians chapters 4 through 5 when Paul gives more details on the mode and details of the rapture. Okay, it is not used in 1 Corinthians 15. Another word, agyro, is used, which means, the Greek word means I raise up. Essentially the same thing, though. Okay, but for what people call the rapture, we're going to focus on 1 Thessalonians 4 through 5, because Paul gives a descriptive detail of events in that passage. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 13, it says, I would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain shall not prevent them which are asleep. In other words, those that have already passed away. Their bodies are asleep. Not their souls, their bodies. Remember, we're triune, body, soul, and spirit. Spirit goes back to God who gave it, as it says in Ecclesiastes, and many of the bodies of the saints which slept arose. Remember, the end of Matthew. So it's the soul that does in fact depart to be with the Messiah, okay? But anyway, back to this. Those which are asleep are the bodies, okay? For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God, and the dead in the Messiah shall rise first. And then we which are alive and remain shall be harpazo, shall be caught up, okay, together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore comfort one another with these words. Chapter 5. Keep reading. Same context. It doesn't end there. But of the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. So the day of the Lord and the coming of the Lord are synonymous. And when the Bible says we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord, that's the entrance coming of the Messiah. It does not suggest that that's before the wrath of God, although we are delivered from the wrath to come, as Paul says in earlier or somewhere in Thessalonians. I believe it was the first chapter of this book. But he says it in either 1st or 2nd Thessalonians that we are not appointed to the wrath of God. That's true. We're not. But he doesn't say in that passage that we're caught up away any time before the wrath hits the earth. Remember, the children of Israel were here during the plagues in Egypt. They were in the midst of Egypt, but they were still delivered from them, okay? Noah was in the midst of the flood, but he was delivered because he obeyed God, and he first of all had faith, then he obeyed God and he built a boat. Okay, so you can be delivered from God's wrath and still be here. And that's all part of the, mysterious workings of God and the Holy Spirit to protect us and to protect Israel. Okay, so the coming of the Lord is as a thief. 3 things come upon a man when he least suspects. 1, the finding of a lost item. 2, the sting of a scorpion. And 3, the coming of Messiah, says the Babylonian Talmud. And so that's our take on, a quick synopsis of our take on Daniel's 70 weeks, on the wrath of God, and on what people will call the rapture, harpazo. You all have a blessed day, and we appreciate the comments and the questions. Thank you all. Be blessed.